This short video describes the extended evolution framework. We will walk through the framework, introduce some terminology, present a template tool, and apply the template to 3 social scenarios. My name is Jaffa Applegate, and I am a member of the research faculty in Arizona State University School of Complex Adaptive Systems. What is the extended evolution framework? Most of us understand evolution as having something to do with a genomic sequence unique to individuals and which undergoes random mutations. Maybe less familiar is another very important evolutionary component, whereby genes and various transcription factors are linked together in a gene regulatory network, which determines which genes are activated and when. Together, these produce an individual with specific characteristics, which we'll call the manifested phenotype. This manifested phenotype is embedded in an environment, and this environment exerts various selection pressures on the characteristics making up the phenotype, such that the selection pressures determine the reproducing population, which ultimately alters gene frequencies, thus the manifestation of future phenotypes. This mechanism, whereby selection pressures alter gene frequencies, thus altering the population of phenotypes, is described by something called the modern synthesis, but we're going to call it heredity 1. When we consider the modifications to the population of regulatory network structures, we have added evolutionary development, known as evo-devo for short, which also falls under the category heredity 1. But back to the manifested phenotype embedded in an environment. Not only does the environment exert influence over the phenotype, but the phenotype also exerts influence on the environment. And sometimes this influence, especially in concert with like phenotypes, can affect a permanent change to the environment. Thus, the organism modifies the environment such that it alters the selection pressures through niche construction and other processes. This meaningful environmental modification is known as externalization, and the resultant set of selection pressures are known as heredity 2. This externalization process and its modified selection pressures again determine reproducing populations, thus gene frequencies, a mechanism we'll call internalization 1. But externalization can also alter the selection for regulatory structures, thus modifying phenotypic development and genetic expression. This mechanism, whereby externalization modifies the regulatory network, is called internalization 2. In summary, genes and their regulatory network modified by selection pressures is heredity 1. And externalization by a phenotype or group of phenotypes produces heredity 2. Heredity refers to persistence, so the gene sequence, the regulatory network, and the selection pressures within the environment are the sources of persistence in this model. Extended evolution, or XEVO for short, includes the environment, which is modifiable by phenotypes, as a source of evolutionary persistence along with genes and the regulatory network. When heredity 2 modifies the genotype, we have internalization 1. And when heredity 2 modifies the regulatory network, we have internalization 2. A quick caveat: this is a simplified version of our modern understanding of evolution, leaving aside such interesting phenomena such as non-coding RNA, jumping genes, and epigenetics, to name a few. But this simplified model is sufficient for our next step. Now, we'd like to generalize this model into a framework that can be applied outside the context of biological evolution, namely to the evolution of social phenomena. We start with possible components that are linked through some sort of systemic process, a combinatory system, which produces something that is selected based on its characteristics, which are a result of that particular combination of components. This something is in an environment that both affects and is affected by the something. which produces selection pressures that result in population modifications in both the possible components and the combinatory system structures. Again, this is internalization 1 and 2. Sources of persistent are the environment itself through externalization, as well as the components and combinatory systems. Another way to think of ex-evo is as a sequence of externalization-internalization processes that occur through things acting within their environment. Now, we'll briefly apply this generalized template to 3 scenarios: making a decision, the development of a product, and the evolution of a financial institution. Our first scenario describes a decision. This could be any decision, but let's consider a commuting decision. The decision is a something which is selected. The material options to choose from are the possible commute options, such as a petrol vehicle, an electric vehicle, bike, or public transportation. In this case, the combinatory process describes the information processing and decision process on the part of each decision maker, which results in a choice between the available options. The decision is embedded in an environment of attitudes, social networks, opinions, as well as infrastructure and policy. But the decision also modifies the environment by adding another type of vehicle or rider, thus, for example, increasing demand for charging stations if the choice is an electric vehicle, an example of externalization. The decisions create changes in behavior which may change priorities, social priorities, resulting in on-the-ground alterations to material options, such as installing more charging stations. This would be an example of internalization 1. At the same time, exposure to other people's decisions can change the way a person makes decisions in the future, an example of internalization 2. Maybe the friend network has more electric car users, and so somebody's influenced by their friends. Our second scenario describes the development of a product, such as the development of a particular sort of car. Here, the item to be selected is a car with specific qualities and characteristics. The material options could be seen as the technology options available to combine to produce the car, while the combinatory method is the specific production processes that obtain and synthesize those elements to produce a car. The car with its specific characteristics is embedded in an environment consisting of consumer preferences and economic costs. In terms of group characteristics, the environment also selects according to innovation processes, supply chain networks, and production practices. The presence of car features modifies consumer preferences through externalization, thus driving innovation to produce novel production elements or to improve on existing ones, an example of internalization 1. Modified supply relationships and production best practices alter the production process possibilities, an example of internalization 2. Our final scenario leaves the transport question aside and uses the ex-evo framework to describe the evolution of institutional structures, in this case, the Eurodollar market. Institutional facts on the ground, such as currencies, banking products, and transfer technologies, interact through international banking law and regulation. Environmental selecting pressures on a financial product include geopolitics, as well as wealth and debt distributions. In this scenario, the move from a gold to dollar standard post-World War II upended the existing regulatory structure, changing the selection pressures, an example of externalization. In response, European banks began offering dollar accounts, which modified financial offerings de jure and the regulatory system de facto, internalization 1 and 2. Thus, the Eurodollar market system evolved, again, a form of externalization. I hope you found this explanation of extended evolution applied to social questions useful, and here are some references for more information. Thank you for your attention.